Welcome to Sahara TV, State to the Nation, and our guest today is an award-winning journalist, a proven muckraker, writer and researcher, David Hundeyin, who made a remarkable investigative documentary piece entitled Bola Ahmed Tinubu, From Drug Lord to Presidential Candidate. And that was published a couple of weeks ago. You can find it online. The documentary offered unique insight and provided a definite narrative on how Tinubu was involved in trafficking in narcotics in the United States. Neither Bola Ahmed Tinubu nor his legal or campaign team have disputed any of the specifics in the Hundeyin's drug reporting documentary. David, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let me start by congratulating you on this extraordinary piece of reporting. Your investigation really this constructs the Tinubu's myth of a self-made man. The actual story which you reported started with his relationship as an accountant with one Akbele and Akonde. So what was the process by which he actually accumulated such stupendous wealth at that time? Can you give us a brief on that, please?
To cut a very long story short, being the bagman, i.e. the money launderer in Nigerian street terms, what you would call the loader or the picker, working for a drug ring in Chicago that was pushing Southeast Asian white heroin, which at the time was a major commodity being trafficked by Nigerian criminal gangs in Chicago. Because if you recall, at the time, Nigeria was also a major global drug trafficking route for cocaine and heroin coming from Southeast Asia. So essentially, that was how he made his initial fortune. And by the way, anybody watching this doesn't need to take my word for it or anybody's word for it. These court records, which the documentary and the initial story were based on, are now available online. In fact, they've been available online for quite a while, as I recall. If I'm not mistaken, the very first media organization in Nigeria to actually put those documents out into the public domain was actually Sahara Reporters in 2008. Even though for whatever reason, it didn't seem to get enough people's attention at the time. But these documents are now everywhere. They're in public circulation. At least 3 other individuals and organizations have independently sourced these documents from the Northern District of Illinois Eastern Division District Court, and they're accessible. So you don't even if you don't want to download the versions that are available online. If you're in the Chicago area, you can actually go to that district court, you pay the filing fee, and you get a copy given to you, a hard copy, or you can get a soft copy burnt onto the CD as well. So really just go through these documents, because what is stated in them is stated in very clear language, very plain English, and it leaves one in no doubt whatsoever as to where the Tinubu fortune originated from. To start with, it stated very clearly that this was somebody who was working with a ring of heroin traffickers in Chicago, trafficking the Southeast Asian white heroin, which was going for between $80,000 and $110,000 per kilogram, and that the 2 traffickers that he was embedded with, who went by the names of Abiodun Agbele and Moise Adegboyega Akonde, these 2 were responsible for heroin sales worth millions. And this was in the 80s, the late 80s going into the early 90s.
Yeah, there's this interview with the news magazine in your documentary, and which has been described as one of the first major Tinubu profiles and a cornerstone of decades of myth making about his fortune. What did the article really say, and what were the main points of this interview about Tinubu?
Right. So for me, the main point, there were several things that were mentioned in the article. There were several lies that he told in that interview. But for me, the major thing to pick out was that this was perhaps the first time that he ever attempted to explain the fact that as a junior accountant, he had millions of dollars in his accounts, which he couldn't reasonably be expected to account for on an income, a declared income of about $28,800 a year. Because on these court records, it stated clearly that by his own admission, by his own written admission, he had a monthly income of $2,400 a month and no other source of income whatsoever. So someone on an annual income of $28,800 having $1.4 million at least in the bank, the math still add up. And I'm guessing the reason he tried to offer that explanation was that he knew that in the run-up to his bid to become president, that maybe someone would try to raise these issues. Because as I said, my story wasn't even the first time that someone has attempted to tell that story of his running with the law in the early 90s. So I think that was part of, as you called it, the myth making that he was trying to project, which is why I thought that it was very important that it wasn't just a matter of gathering the facts, it was also a matter of effective storytelling this time around, because I believe that part of what has got Tinubu so far is the sheer competence of the myth makers, the PR people he has working for him, the media practitioners he has around him, who put out this constant stream of just misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, and are just constantly feeding people stories and narratives. Some of them are not outright lies, but some of them are misdirections, which are actually worse than lies, in my opinion, because they infuse a bit of the truth, a bit of dishonesty. So it's difficult to then differentiate between what is true and what is not. Tinubu is a master of doing this, or at least the people around him are masters at doing this.
Exactly, and I
So,
guess that Tinubu got used to people taking him at his word, even when his
exactly.
words wasn't true.
Exactly. Even when words make no sense. So, for example, in the interview where the explanation that he offered for having $1.8 million in his account was that he worked on an engagement as a consultant at a Big Four firm. And the engagement happened to be at National Oil, which later became Saudi Aramco, and that he was paid a bonus of 850,000 US dollars. First of all, he's expecting that both the journalists interviewing him and the audience reading that interview don't even know, first of all, what Saudi Aramco is. They just hear that, oh, it's a Saudi state-owned oil company. So that means, oh my God, there's loads of money. And then they don't understand what a consulting job is at a Big Four firm. The name Deloitte just sounds very impressive. So to people who aren't part of the system or who don't know any better, it sounds kind of plausible. It sounds kind of believable. Meanwhile, for anyone who has spent 2 weeks working at a consulting organization, you would know instantly that this is a big flaming ball of nonsense. Because there's no way that even as a partner, an equity partner, even if you are Akintola Williams, who owns the Deloitte franchise in Nigeria, you do not get paid that kind of money on a single engagement. It is not true. Much less in the 80s, as a junior member of staff, as an entry-level consultant, that is categorically not true, right? But again, he's so used to having an audience that just doesn't know any better, and an audience that is also very intellectually lazy. He has got away with these things he was governor for 2 terms. So I'm guessing to him now, even up until now, he's probably confused that why is this an issue all of a sudden? You guys have believed everything I've said for the past 30 odd years. Why am I all of a sudden being asked these questions? Why are people all of a sudden just starting to realize that I've not been truthful? Like, I thought you people didn't care about such things. But the truth is that it's not as if people didn't care. It's just that they didn't know any better. And which is why I thought that as a journalist, my job is to tell this story in a way that will make people care and that will make them understand what exactly it is, the Jedi mind trick that is being done to them, the wool that is being pulled over their eyes, as against just presenting the who, what, when, where, how, the 5 W's and the H, as you are taught in school, at the classical journalism program. And then that's it. You just sort of throw the story in the audience's face and leave it. And then whether the story lands or it doesn't land, you feel like, well, I've done my job as a journalist. I think that's an incomplete way of doing your job. I think journalism nowadays has also evolved into having an impact, into understanding the mechanics of audience engagement, the mechanics of storytelling. So, for example, the fact that I even did a visual documentary was part of this strategy, because initially this was a written story that I published in July. And that's all it was supposed to be. But after publishing the story, and despite the fact that the story itself had some sizable impact, I mean, based on the back end metrics on my platform, close to 1 million people read it. But even then, I still felt as if the penny hasn't really dropped.
Exactly.
So maybe this needs to be opened up to a new audience. Maybe people who don't have the ability to sit down and read 6,000 words in one sitting. Maybe this information has not reached them. So the way to do this is to put it in visual format. Initially, I toyed with the idea. Other people had tried to do something around this, so they'd sort of like read out the text of the story, maybe add a few images on screen and just put it out like that. But I thought, like, this is not really landing, because it's almost like it's like listening to an audiobook. It's not the same thing. It's not a visual experience. And I know that Nigerian audiences love visual experience.
Exactly.
I used to work in TV, right? I worked at Channels TV for just over a year. So I understand the difference between the written medium and the visual medium. So I thought, okay, this needs to be done as a proper documentary. So it wasn't even my first attempt at doing something like that. I'd done my first attempt at a documentary, West Africa Wiki documentary, was a previous story I'd worked on called Conflicts for Jihad, the Boko Haram origin story. Yeah. And based on the sort of feedback and the things I had picked up from how I did that documentary, I thought, okay, this is how I'm going to attack this one. So first of all, I'm not going to show my face at all, right? So it's not like I'm sitting down and reading a story to the audience, because that makes it boring and that makes people tune out. So instead, this is going to be 30 minutes full of just visual, moving images and B-roll on screen to keep the audience fully engaged for the entire 30 minutes, so that the real meat of the story, which is those court documents from the Eastern District of Illinois, the Northern District of Illinois Eastern Division District Court, the information in those documents is going to be highlighted, and people are going to be able to use their eyes to follow it and to see exactly what was said, so that if they didn't sit down to read the 6,000 words, but here it is in your face.
That's right. I mean, that would have actually taken such meticulous sourcing and piecing together those findings from those patchworks of public and private documents that you have. And it's quite unusual to dive into what you think is an extremely well covered subject and to find so much completely new stuff, so to say. It's unusual to dive into what you think is an extremely well covered subject, and you find completely new stuff that just is astonishing, and a great reminder that even things that you think are well described, there are these other deeper layers. What are the deeper layers that you actually see and that you pointed out that the audience really need to get engaged with?
So for me, one of the things that I thought was very important, that for whatever reason they didn't seem to have got much coverage outside of my own story, was that right after he was approached by the US authorities in 1992 and they asked him questions about this thing. This person went on a buying spree, purchasing real estate, all over the US, and putting down huge sums of money, $147,000, $500,000 in cash, right? He wasn't using mortgages to buy these. It would have been bad enough if he was using mortgages to buy these properties, because even to get a mortgage, you have to put down a sizable down payment, I believe 10 or 15%. That would have been bad enough if a property of $450,000, you are financing it, because why are you using $45,000-$50,000 to finance it from? But he wasn't even doing that. He was paying in full and upfront cash. So where did somebody who claimed to be a fugitive, who had been cleaned out by a Abacha, who was living almost like a pauper, where was he seeing these sums of money to purchase expensive real estate up and down the US? And then it didn't end with him, even going to his kids, his two youngest kids.
We're actually going to get to that too eventually. It's quite astonishing. Let's look at I mean, the spin doctors. I mean, we had the likes of Kende Bambeton, Festus Keyamo, and Femi Kayode. I mean, who have attacked you one way or the other. Not to talk of the others. For example, Bambeton at a point in time attempted to stand reason on his head by stating that Tinubu is clean as a whistle because he can go in and out of the United States without let or hindrance, considering the fact that he has not been convicted. Just like, I mean, that's just being the Spain. What's your reaction to all this?
I just feel like, again, if people actually read these documents by themselves, then it wouldn't matter what the likes of Fani Kayode or Keyamo or Bamileto have to say, because these guys are working for their bread. It's their daily bread that they're working for. So, as you said, if they need to stand reason on his head, they will do so, because that's what PR people do. The reason I'm not even as offended at such people as I should be is that I used to work in PR before I became a journalist. Before I started practicing as a journalist, I worked in commercial PR. Fortunately, the agency I worked at didn't do political work, but lots of our sister agencies did political work. So I had a very close view of what it means to be an image maker for a politician or for a public figure, for a government. And the truth is that industry, a lot of my friends work there. It's where my career started. I have a lot of links there. But having said that, it's a very morally bankrupt industry. People do what they have to do to get paid. That's just the reality. So if your client, you know that your client has done something terrible, you know that your client is an objectively terrible human being, you know that even you wouldn't trust your client around, your family or whatnot. But at the end of the day, where else are you going to see a client that is paying XYZ amount of money, and you have bills to pay? So you do what you have to do. So I understand where these guys are coming from. I don't condone it, but I understand it. So which is why my position has always been that, look, people should really ignore what PR people, image makers working for politicians have to say. Go and read these documents yourself, because the US District Court, which put these documents out in 1993, when I was about 3 years old. Clearly, I didn't have any influence in that entire process. So it's fair to say that these documents are based on objective facts that have nothing to do with me. So go read what the documents have to say. And when you've read what they have to say, then you will see that all the defenses being put out is just people trying to be clever by half. Like when Festus Keyamo came out and said, "Oh, the seizure of $460,000 wasn't drug money seizure; that it was tax."
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
back
tax related.
And it doesn't take you 10 seconds to even if you haven't read the court documents, but to just use a bit of logic that how is it that an accountant on $28,800 a year could have been owing $460,000 in taxes? How? Exactly. On what income? With no other stated source of income. Where did that tax liability come from? Based on what income? And obviously, Festus Keyamo would have no answer to that. But the purpose of throwing out these narratives isn't to sound coherent. It isn't to even attempt to rebut the story that I have put out. It's just to have something to respond to. It's just so that you can say that I've responded. And it's very important for people to understand that this is how PR works, right? You can't even call it an allegation, because these aren't allegations. Like, these are proven things, right? Somebody puts something out about your client or your brand, and you feel you are under pressure to respond, right? But you know that you have nothing to respond with. You are guilty 100%. So what you then do is, let's say I've been accused of stealing a chicken or something. I then come out, make a lot of funfair about the fact that I'm coming out to make a statement. I go on national TV or whatever. And then instead of attacking the core issue, did I or did I not steal a chicken, I'll now seize on an issue that is adjacent to it, slightly adjacent to it. Maybe I'll attack the personality of the person who has accused me of stealing the chicken, or I'll go off on a tangent about how I donated to a charity that takes care of chickens, right? And spend 15 minutes saying plenty of nothing in as many words as possible. And then afterwards, I will then go on Twitter and say, I have responded to these allegations and I don't consider them worth my time anymore because I have responded and I consider the matter closed. Right? That's the
Ridiculous.
Jedi mind trick that PR professionals play. So it's important people understand how these things work.
It's quite ridiculous. Let's talk a little bit about Tinubu's children and real estate purchases without, just like you stated in that documentary, no known source of income. Will there be indictments or investigations?
First of all, bear in mind that these things didn't happen in the Nigerian jurisdiction. These things happen in the States. The US government itself has some level of fault here because I mean, there are all sorts of anti-money laundering laws in the United States that should have caught on to the fact that, first of all, this is the child of a politically exposed individual, a politically exposed person.
Yeah.
And secondly, the economic profile of this child. This person is fresh out of school, doesn't even have a job, has no known source of income, and this person is buying luxury real estate in New York worth millions of dollars that most 90% of Americans cannot aspire to afford in their lives. Something smells here. Something's off. And then this is a transaction which is being done in cash, full and upfront cash payments. Right. So how exactly is that possible? So questions should have been asked. Right. I know for a fact that there are anti-money laundering regulations that should have made it such that questions were asked. But for whatever reason, these funny transactions were allowed to sail through. So I think the US authorities, or well, let me be specific, the municipal authorities in places like New York have questions to answer because
Exactly. Because I also wanted to point out that during the I took time out to actually watch that documentary, and you made some scathing indictments, especially against the person of late Chief MQ Abiola and drug-related proceeds, as well as the American government with regards to the plea bargain and the pro-democracy movement during the crazy 90s, as you put it in that documentary. Would you like to shed more light on that?
Well, so this isn't an attempt to have a go at the US government. I believe the world is better. Certainly, Nigeria is better for having had engagements with the US government. At times in our recent history, over the past 2 or 3 decades, the US government has been the strongest pro-democracy force that has mitigated against our military, adventurers. But having said that, Uncle Sam does have double standards. The US government does play fast and loose. So, and this is not restricted to its relationship with Nigeria, by the way. This goes all the way. If you're familiar with the Iran-Contra affair, and when during that Cold War era, when this is on official record, that the CIA got involved in the drugs business. There was a nexus of drug trafficking between South America and the US, and CIA was using the funds raised from that operation to buy arms for certain groups that it used to counteract pro-communist groups in South America. So you know that the US, even though it has stated ideals and principles, has been known to play fast and loose with its own laws and its own principles. And at the end of the day, the worst thing that will happen is that somebody will there'll be a probe, there'll be an inquiry, there'll be a congressional inquiry or something. Somebody might get sent to jail and that'll be that. The matter will be closed. A lot of it is going to be redacted and kept and classified for the next 50 years. And you won't even hear the full story of what happened. So that's even in the course of putting this story together, I made a lot of attempts to get in touch with everybody that I can get in touch with. If there was a guy called Andre Kellum, who used to work at the US mission in Nigeria, sometime around 2003, when that infamous letter that they keep referencing was sent to Tafa Balogun. And I reached out to him that, okay, I've seen a document that has your name and signature on it, which basically states that Bola Tinubu was, in fact, under investigation for drug-related offenses in the US. Can you offer your comments on this? And in the documentary, I actually put up a screenshot of his response to me. And he says, I no longer work for the US government. And, if I say something, it might affect, the U.S. mission in Lagos. So please reach out to the Public Affairs Division of the DEA. DEA is the Drug Enforcement
Agents.
Administration. That's like their NDLEA.
Yeah.
So I did that. I reached out to the DEA's Public Affairs unit, the division, and it states on their website that all media inquiries are attended to within 24 hours. Well, I sent that inquiry in July. We're in November now. I didn't get a response. I followed up twice. I got the automated response, right? The automatic email you get in response. And beyond that, stonewall silence. This is not the first time I'm reaching out to the DEA for other things, and I've got information for other things. But when it came to this particular case, for some very strange reasons, radio silence.
Wow. That's
of whatever plea bargain or settlement that this case was settled with, are terms which, for whatever reason, are not to be made public. What I suspect, obviously, there's no because of how secretive they are, there's no documentation to back this up. But what I suspect is that Tinubu became an informant working for the DEA, and as part of the bargain of becoming an informant, he was basically allowed to walk, which is how come he can, he can go in and out of the US, as they're always proudly trumpeting, even though nobody made any reference to that. And which I would suspect is why the US authorities are so cagey about releasing information about this. I mean, there are FOI requests that have been sent to the FBI. And till now, as we speak, I'm still going back and forth with the FBI. Right. They haven't said no, in fairness to them. They haven't said, no, we're not going to give you access to those documents. But there's a lot of back and forth. Because bear in mind that the overall case, which the Tinubu investigation was just a part of, was actually a case about drug trafficking in Gary, Indiana. And the pinpoint of it was a guy called Lee Andrew Edwards. So he's actually the pinpoint. He died in 2004, by the way. So his records can be accessed by the public now because he's dead. But you have to go through the FOI route. And so going back and forth, they said they have more than 7,000 pages of documents related to this case. So you have to narrow down this, send a narrowed down request. Okay, it's going to cost you like more than $2,000 to get this information. Wow. Okay, I'll try and raise the money. Let's narrow it down here, blah, 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 blah. And there's still a lot of back and forth. So eventually, I will get the information that I'm looking for. It's there somewhere. It will be released, even though they are making it as difficult and as convoluted as possible to get hold of it. But it's there somewhere. And eventually, we will get to find out what exactly it is that Uncle Sam has decided that it's so embarrassed about.
All right, let me get your perspective on this. INEC National Commissioner in charge of Information and Voter Education Committee, Barrister Festus Okoye, was quoted as saying that the commission was in talks with the United States Authority to get more details on the allegations involving the APC presidential candidate, with a view to determining whether the APC standard bearer may have violated relevant provisions of the Electoral Law 2022 as amended. Do you see anything coming out of such a?
So that particular document that you're referencing, that letter was actually a fake. It didn't originate from INEC.
Yeah.
I suspect that it was the APC itself that put this letter out there as part of the games that it plays. Because if you recall, as soon as this letter emerged out of nowhere, nobody knows where it emerged from, but it just emerged. Exactly. And I think Arise TV carried it. Then immediately the NBC came out and fined Arise TV for putting out fake news. And INEC came out and said this letter didn't originate from us. This is fake news. Exactly. And then the APC came out 24 hours later and said they're going to sue Arise TV. Blah blah. There was a lot of hurdy-gurdy around it. So I suspect that this is just part of the gamesmanship that the ruling party deploys when it is trying to bury a story. So I think what they were hoping for is that people like myself would jump on that document and be like, yes, this is proof of blah, blah, blah. And then it gets debunked. And then by association, all the work that I've done will also get debunked. Bear in mind that this is how PR practitioners do their, which is why I said that PR is a very morally bankrupt industry, unfortunately.
How disconcerting is it for you that an individual with such magnitude of scandal, which you had described as one of the biggest scandal in Nigeria history in one of your recent interview, still has so much supporters with their sycophancy and ethnic bigotry?
Well, as much as we want to hide from it, the fact is that Nigeria is not a developed society. It's not a developed culture. It's unfortunate, but it's the reality. It's not a nice thing to admit that we come from a society and a culture that is still very primordial in some ways, in many ways. But it's unfortunately it's the truth. It just is what it is. So one thing I was always clear about, that I'm always clear about whenever I'm asked to give a comment on this question, that what is your goal by putting out the story? What's your aim in all of this? I'm always clear that look, the point of this isn't maybe to try and pressurize the courts or INEC into taking certain kinds of action, even though ideally that's what should happen. But that's not the purpose of this, because we know that one way or the other, this man is going to be on that ballot next year. One way or the other. We know. And we know that one way or the other, this man is also going to get millions of votes next year. One way or the other. So, I mean, I used to make a joke a couple of years ago until I realized that there's nothing funny about it, and I stopped making that joke. I used to make a joke that if you could wake Sani Abacha from the dead, if you could reanimate his corpse and make a run for president, that he'll probably win. And I used to say that as like hyperbole until I realized that it wasn't a joke at all. There would be a very significant non-zero chance that Sani Abacha would actually win the presidency if he could bring him back from the dead, despite knowing all that we know about him now. So, sort of purpose of my mission in all of this is to take away the excuse that people always cite from 2015. Because when you ask people that, okay, in the year 2015 AD, what exactly was it that you saw in Muhammadu Buhari that convinced you that this person was fit to be your president and that this person was fit to be the CEO of a $500 billion economy, the world's, at the time, the world's third fastest growing economy? Like, what was it that you saw in this person who just 4 years prior, when he lost the election in 2011, was responsible for basically a massacre that killed close to 1,000 innocent people? And instead of calling off his supporters, instead went on TV and basically incited them. He was photographed crying on TV, which became this very incendiary, emotive image that exacerbated the situation. So, and then he later went on and threatened that if he doesn't win the election, that there'll be problems. Right. So, what was it that made you look at this guy and think, okay, this troglodyte, this renowned ethnic bigot, this renowned religious and ethnic bigot, who has no message beyond identity politics? What was it that you saw in this person that made you think that this person would represent or offer good 21st century economic and social leadership that Nigeria needed? That if Goodluck Jonathan was a terrible president, that this was the guy who was going to improve on what Goodluck Jonathan had to offer. What was it that you saw? And the instant response is, we didn't know. How could we have known? You couldn't have been expected to know. The journalists didn't do their job. The press was compromised. There were so many questions that were not asked, blah, 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 excuse after excuse after excuse after excuse. I don't believe that those things are excuses, because even as at 2014, statistically, most Nigerians had access to high-speed, relatively cheap internet access and an Android smartphone at the very least, or a BlackBerry device at the time. So there was no reason for people not to have access to information at the time. But now, even more so. So my mission in all of this is to take that excuse away. But that this information has been slammed in front of the eyeballs through every available media. It's been in print, it's been in visual formats. You've heard it all over your radio, your Twitter spaces, your Clubhouse sessions. You're going to watch it on SaharaTV. You're going to see it on YouTube. You've seen it on Arise TV. You've seen it on Channels TV. You've seen it everywhere. So now there is no excuse for you to not know who and what you are voting for. And I know that in spite of that, a lot of people will still vote for him anyway. But if they do, and when they do, if, I hope not, but if he's successful and he becomes president, then the consequences or the outcomes of a Bola Tinubu presidency will not be blamed, first of all, on the media or journalists, because we've done our job this time around. And then secondly, nobody would then say, I couldn't have known, or I didn't know, because no, you knew. You know now. So in February 2023, you will know. So you knew. So, and for me, that is a very important thing, because speaking from the point of view of a person who has a lot of interest in African development, specifically West African societal and economic development, one thing I keep constantly coming across, and it doesn't matter which country it is, it's like an African issue, is this total lack, this abdication of personal responsibility. It's always someone else's fault. It's always this other group's fault. It's always that there is never any instance where the individual accepts culpability for something. And this time around, I'm like, no, people need to accept that there is a link, there's a causal link between action and reaction. There's a causal link between making a certain electoral decision and the outcomes of voting for that person to be president. So there's a link between voting for an army general as your president and people ending up getting shot at Lekki Toll Plaza during a peaceful protest. There's a link between both things. There's a link between voting a drug pusher as your president and ending up with a president which ended up with a presidency and a government which will be run like a mafia organization to your detriment. There's a causal link between the two, because that link between action and reaction, it seems as if like across every strata of African society, that link doesn't really exist. People don't understand that there is a link between doing something and the outcomes of your actions. People don't understand consequences that's taken away. So whether Tinubu becomes president or not, I've achieved my own personal goal in all of this.
David Hundeyin, it's been a pleasure having this conversation with you. Thank you for your reporting, and thank you for telling us about it.
Thank you for having me.